Okay, thanks very much. And thank you all for attending. It's fantastic to see so many colleagues on a Sunday afternoon. It's brilliant. So these are some data from one of the surveys conducted by the World Federation of Hemophilia. And I think one of the things that WFH are very good at is recording and documenting. And although this says 2014, there are ongoing surveys not yet, let's say, fully analysed. And the points I wanted to make on this slide, this is a survey which includes data from more than 100 countries. We don't have time to review all that, of course, you'll be pleased to hear. But I wanted to just mention some of the categories, let's say. So this is the UK, I'm from the UK as you know. Number of patients registered, diagnosed with haemophilia A or haemophilia B. Number of patients diagnosed, registered with von Willebrand's disease and other bleeding disorders. And there are a handful of countries in this registry. UK is one, Canada, one or two other countries, where this figure is bigger. And there may be some overdiagnosis, there almost certainly is some, let's say, misdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, as a consequence of the issues that we're now discussing. This is perhaps a more typical pattern for, let's say, well-resourced countries. But we've got a number, and there's a very large number actually, of countries in the register which we might consider to be lower resource, and it's not the case that these are people who are unable to make the testing, but the resources, let's say, inhibit. And I didn't show you the population, but these are both countries with populations significantly greater than the population of the UK. So there's an issue in terms of haemophilia diagnosis, okay, but I wanted to draw attention to this. There is a massive absence of diagnosed von Willebrand's disease, and there are many countries in this category. I'm not an epidemiologist, and of course it's, in principle, I suppose, possible that that's because we're not seeing von Willebrand's disease in these areas, but I really don't think that's the case. I'd be interested in other people's views. But these are areas in which the testing is not occurring. The right patients are not getting into the system, and when they do, the tests are simply not available to make the diagnosis. So this is an area that absolutely needs very serious attention, in my opinion. And when we look at the reasons, as Sukesh has mentioned, we're running a program on behalf of WFH. We did a survey recently in February this year. We asked centres who participate. 2/3 of those are in low-resource countries. About a third are, let's say, well-established high-resource centres. And this is the number of new patients diagnosed in the previous 5 years, running up to earlier this year. And about 2/3 of the centres responded, and about 2/3 of those were in low-resource settings. And this is the number of, let's say, newly diagnosed, the total of haemophilia A or haemophilia B. And this is new cases of von Willebrand's disease. So you can see there's a substantial difference. And I think Sukesh has given us some of the reasons for this. Don't have the equipment, don't have the reagents, don't have the trained staff. This is a particular issue, and it's not restricted to an individual region. We're seeing this all over the world, including, let's say, higher resource places. One lab in the USA said we don't have enough trained staff. This is increasingly a problem. It's the same in the UK. And I think one of our jobs as those involved in laboratory diagnosis, we have to get the message to administrators that spending money on laboratory tests is cheap. It's good medicine. It saves problems later. It saves it doesn't just deliver good patient care later. That saves money, and this is a message we've got to get through to people. So it's a big issue, and I think it's right that we're focusing on it this afternoon. So we've heard a lot about the increased uptake and use of some of the newer assays, and I absolutely agree with the comments which came earlier from from Francesca, that there are a number of advantages to these newer assays. This is showing the decline, let's say, in aggregometry. Let's say traditional VWF risk-seating cofactor assays is declining. This is among centres who participate in a UK proficiency testing programme, but about 1/3 of these sites are actually outside the UK, in Europe and elsewhere. We still allow Europeans in our programme, even if we decided to dissociate for other reasons. You can see that some of the new assays are increasingly being used. There's more or less a steady state of this particular assay. This is VWF antigen by the recently revised nomenclature. You can see in particular, and I think this is encouraging, an increase in uptake in in these two assays, and I again agree with the comments earlier that these are assays which have advantages over and above ristocetin cofactor, despite, let's say, the few cases who sit on the threshold who change category. Nevertheless, I think these are absolutely useful assays. In my own centre, we switched to one of these from a ristocetin cofactor successfully, so I am in favour of using these assays. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that we don't always get the same results. We've seen some examples already. These are data for some specific cases distributed through the UK National Quality Assurance Programme. This is a normal plasma. You can see another normal here. But even in these normal samples, the results are not the same. You can see higher results here compared to here, and the same pattern to a lesser extent here. And I think some of the reason for that is because we don't yet have suitably calibrated international reference preparations, and that's an action and activity for the VWF subcommittee that they're addressing. Tony Hubbard and others in NIBS and C are working on this issue, so I think we can be optimistic that this may improve a little bit in future as we're able to assist manufacturers in their efforts to improve calibration, let's say. When we come to establish cases with von Willebrand's disease, you can see some differences between the results, and not always in the same direction. Here we can see a higher result with this particular type 2A patient, and this is a different case to this one where we're seeing a slightly different pattern. So results are not interchangeable. But nevertheless, we're able to successfully make the diagnosis using any of these assays. And the same here. One mention of preanalytical variables. It's important that we make our VWF assays on suitably handled samples. These are some data from Australia who looked at the storage of whole blood samples from normal subjects. If we put that blood sample into the fridge before it's processed and centrifuged, even for as little as 3 or 4 hours, we're starting to lose VWF. We're starting to lose factor VIII. And in fact, there is a discrepancy between the rate of loss. And the outcome of this is that approximately half of these normal subjects start to look like type 1 von Willebrand's disease, and it's an artifact. Actually, if you put blood from a type 1 von Willebrand's disease in the fridge, it starts to look like a type 2. You can reverse this if you heat the sample, but I think that's bad practice. We can avoid this. We should not store our samples, whole blood samples, in the fridge. Bad practice. Some cases. So this is a case from our centre, and I tried to pick, let's say, typical cases, not carefully selected, but some examples. It's what I was asked to do. So this is a patient who's genetically confirmed type 2A von Willebrand's disease. We have some centres in our IEQUAS programme who've been able to establish a VWF antigen assay, but not yet put in place any activity assay. And I think we have to, in that case, be aware that we really will sometimes see this kind of issue, totally normal VWF antigen, normal factor VIII here, and let's say borderline at best here, and only when we come to a genuine activity assay will we correctly pick up the patient. If we can only do a single assay in relation to VWD testing, we need a good activity or ristocetin cofactor assay. I'll come back to that point. This is a patient, another case from our centre with acquired von Willebrand's disease, and Annette Boyer, who's in the audience, has written up this case. It's recently published in Hemophilia, so you can get the detail from there. This is the patient, a leukemia patient, no personal history of bleeding in the past with a number of challenges, but nevertheless clotting investigations, worries about leukemia and so on. Grossly prolonged APTT, factor VIII reduced, one-stage assay here, and since we've got a lot of interest in chromogenic assays, we'll be seeing more about chromogenic assays over the course of the meeting. We'll also show you here the chromogenic result. In this kind of patient, you can see the numbers are the same. Straightforward so far. Antigen assay reduced high molecular weight multimers, and a number of different VWF activity or ristocetin cofactor assays correctly making the diagnosis, let's say. This is a visual agglutination assay, and I agree with the comments made earlier about the limit of detection for many ristocetin cofactor assays is absolutely inadequate. Might be 20, might be 15. This is one which in experienced hands can actually go down to this kind of level. I'll show you some more numbers on that. Correctly below the level of detection. Also picked up by this. This is a platelet-based aggregation assay, but run on an analyzer. So this is not the recent Siemens Innovance latex-based assay. We've heard something also here already, and you can see a collagen binding assay. So, okay, fine, all straightforward. Except, if we had only used this particular, let's say, recently developed latex assay, Siemens Innovance, totally normal result. I didn't bring the results on a number of other samples, but this was a consistent finding. Another of the assays recently developed, this one is the VWF antibody terminology. This is one of the IL assays. Actually, this was off-scale high. We were unable to obtain a result. So it's some interference with some latex assays, but not others. And we know from this and other assays that there are interfering substances like rheumatoid factor or heterophile antibodies, human anti-mouse antibodies, for example, can interfere. We weren't able to identify for sure what the cause was in this patient, but the results of HAMA were, let's say, borderline, not convincing, but certainly something's interfering. So this is a rare event. It's not a reason why we can't use this assay in routine use, but we have to be aware of this when we're interpreting results. And I think this is also the case for, let's say, a carefully controlled ristocetin cofactor outside of some of the populations that were discussed earlier. This is a comment taken from the UK guideline in relation to diagnosis of von Willebrand's disease. And this reminds us that we need to make a diagnosis not with a single sample, but to obtain concordant results. Not always easy to do. Some examples. These are individual cases from my centre. This is the number of samples we investigated, we analysed from each of these cases over a number of years. This was the time frame. And where this says ristocetin cofactor, this is a visual agglutination assay that I'll show you just two slides on in a moment, keeping in mind the time. So just to illustrate the kind of variability we might see in these cases over time. And you can see for this patient who is a possible type 1 von Willebrand's disease, in the current diagnosis guideline from UK colleagues, published in 2014, it would fit the criteria. They talk about low VWF rather than confirmed VWD. And you can see the kind of variability we're seeing in these results. You know that these things change up and down over time. But you can also see here for the ristocetin cofactor, again, this carefully controlled visual agglutination assay, we are able to obtain very reproducible results, even at these very low levels. So I would not dismiss this assay. I really wouldn't. I hope that if you're not able to, let's say, spend the money on the more recently available latex assays, this is still an expensive assay, but it's less expensive in most parts of the world, and it's absolutely worth doing if there is not an alternative, in my opinion. Another case to illustrate it can be extremely tricky. This is, I'm sorry, the newest samples are here and the oldest are here, so you can see some results here on 3 different occasions by this VWF glycoprotein 1b M for mutant, the Siemens Innovance assay. Fairly reproducible, but all normal results. This is just inside the reference range, in contrast to these results with the VWF ristocetin cofactor. This is visual agglutination, which are all below or just below the reference range. Is this von Willebrand's disease? Maybe not. When this patient was due for surgery, nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind this level when making management decisions. So it's still useful information. This is the equipment which is required to run the visual agglutination assay. It's an old slide because you can see we still had possibility to have smoking somewhere in the hospital. But nevertheless, it's not so old. This is an assay we continue to use in very occasional patients, but which we used routinely until only 2 years ago, 3 years ago, thereabouts. We need only a source of normal platelets and a source of ristocetin. It looks like this. We wash the platelets, we get rid of the plasma, get rid of the VWF, they're fixed. We add some ristocetin and we see these flocculates form in the tube. And with practice, it's possible to use this successfully. The results I showed you, that's all with this assay. And these are some data on precision, last slide. These were unselected, consecutive results. I picked a period of, it was about well, you can probably see it at the, no, I can't see it at the bottom. It was a period of 6 months or so, if I recall. And I separated the results on the same QC sample into those which were done by the same operator and those which were done by anybody else. And anybody else turned out to be 5 different people, and I was one of those. And the single operator was the person in the section who was doing the most testing at the time. And you can see that the CV is, I think, pretty impressive. I don't show you the figure, but it's about 6 or 7%. So again, with care, I think it is possible. So I'd be interested in comments from others when we get to the Q&A session. But if we can't do, for any reason, the more recently available, with some advantages, latex-based assays, this is absolutely an assay which should be considered, in my opinion. It's absolutely better to do this than not take the responsibility to try to diagnose von Willebrand's disease. Thank you for your attention.